Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his tie for the third time that morning, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of his small apartment. 6 months ago, he had been wearing desert camouflage and carrying a rifle through the mountains of Afghanistan. Today, he was putting on a business suit to start his new job at Davidson Manufacturing, a mid-sized company that produced industrial equipment in Ohio. The transition from Navy SEAL to civilian employee had not been easy. Marcus had spent 12 years in the military, 8 of those as an elite special operations soldier. He had led missions behind enemy lines, rescued hostages, and survived situations that would break most men. But nothing had prepared him for the challenge of fitting into corporate America. At 34 years old, Marcus was older than most new hires at Davidson Manufacturing. His military bearing was obvious in the way he walked, spoke, and carried himself. While some of his co-workers respected his service, others seemed uncomfortable around him. Marcus tried to blend in, but his disciplined nature and direct communication style made him stand out. The problem started small during his first week on the job. Marcus worked in the logistics department, coordinating shipments and managing inventory. His supervisor, Janet Walsh, was a fair woman in her 50s who appreciated Marcus's attention to detail and reliability. She often praised his work and mentioned how refreshing it was to have someone who showed up on time and took pride in their responsibilities. However, not everyone in the department felt the same way. 3 co-workers in particular seemed to take issue with Marcus from the beginning. There was Brad Simpson, a loud man in his late 20s who had worked at Davidson for 5 years. Brad often made jokes about military people being damaged goods and suggested that veterans couldn't handle normal jobs. He would make these comments when Marcus was within earshot, then laugh with his friends as if they were innocent observations. The second problem was Kevin Torres, a man about Marcus's age who had been passed over for a promotion when Marcus was hired. Kevin had applied for the same position and felt that his seniority should have counted for more than Marcus's military experience. He made no effort to hide his resentment and often questioned Marcus's decisions in front of other employees. The third member of what Marcus privately called the trio was Danny Walsh, Janet's nephew who worked in the same department. Danny was 26 years old and had been given his job through family connections rather than qualifications. He was lazy, unreliable, and often left his work for others to complete. When Marcus began covering for Danny's mistakes without complaint, Danny seemed to interpret this as weakness rather than professionalism. The harassment began as subtle comments and small acts of disrespect. Brad would make jokes about post-traumatic stress disorder whenever Marcus was around, asking loudly if anyone had heard any loud noises that might trigger the veteran. Kevin would deliberately give Marcus incorrect information about shipments, then act surprised when problems arose. Danny would leave his paperwork on Marcus's desk with notes saying things like, "Maybe the soldier boy can figure this out." Marcus tried to handle the situation professionally. He had been trained to work with difficult personalities and understood that not everyone would appreciate his background. He focused on his job, completed his tasks efficiently, and tried to build positive relationships with his other co-workers. Many of his colleagues were good people who treated him with respect, and Marcus didn't want to create problems that might affect the entire workplace. As weeks passed, the 3 men seemed to interpret Marcus's restraint as permission to escalate their behavior. They began leaving fake military recruitment flyers on his desk with messages like, "Time to go back where you belong." They would stand behind him when he was working and make comments about how intense he looked, suggesting that he might snap at any moment. The psychological pressure was different from anything Marcus had experienced in combat. In military situations, threats were direct and could be addressed with appropriate force. In the corporate world, the attacks were subtle, designed to avoid detection by supervisors while still causing maximum stress to the target. Marcus found himself questioning his own reactions, wondering if he was being too sensitive or if the situation was as serious as it felt. One afternoon in late October, Marcus was organizing shipment schedules when he overheard Brad talking to Kevin near the coffee machine. Brad was speaking loudly enough for Marcus to hear, describing a news story about a veteran who had committed a violent crime. "You never know with these military types," Brad said. "They're trained to kill, and when they can't handle civilian life, they take it out on innocent people." Kevin nodded in agreement, glancing toward Marcus's desk. Makes you wonder what kind of background checks they do around here. I mean, how do we know what really happened over there? What if he did something that got people killed? What if that's why he had to leave the military? The comments stung because they touched on Marcus's deepest fears about civilian judgment of his service. He had indeed made life and death decisions during his deployments, and some of those decisions haunted him. But he had always acted with honor and had never compromised his values, even in the most difficult circumstances. Hearing his service questioned by men who had never faced real danger made his jaw clench with suppressed anger. Marcus's wife, Sarah, noticed the changes in his behavior at home. Sarah was a nurse who worked at the local hospital, and she had supported Marcus through his transition from military to civilian life. She knew the signs of stress and could see that something was affecting her husband's peace of mind. "You're not sleeping well," she observed one evening as they sat together on their couch. "And you've been quiet lately. Is everything okay at work?" Marcus hesitated before answering. He didn't want to worry Sarah, and he was still hoping that he could resolve the situation without creating a larger conflict. "There are some personality conflicts," he said carefully. "Nothing I can't handle." Sarah studied his face with the practiced eye of someone who had treated trauma patients. "Marcus, you know you can tell me anything. If someone is giving you trouble, maybe we should talk about it." "It's just workplace politics," Marcus replied. "Some people have issues with veterans. I'm trying to work through it professionally." But, even as he said the words, Marcus knew that the situation was moving beyond simple workplace politics. The three men were becoming bolder in their harassment, and he could sense that they were building towards something more serious. His military training had taught him to recognize escalating threats, and every instinct told him that this conflict was far from over. The breaking point came closer each day, and Marcus found himself preparing mentally for a confrontation he hoped would never come. He had spent years learning to control his reactions and channel his training into productive outlets, but his patience was being tested in ways he had never expected. The question was not whether these men would push too far, but when and how Marcus would respond when they finally crossed the line that separated harassment from something much more dangerous. November brought colder weather to Ohio, and, with it, an escalation in the harassment that Marcus Rodriguez faced at Davidson Manufacturing. What had started as crude jokes and subtle disrespect had evolved into a systematic campaign designed to drive him from his job. Brad Simpson, Kevin Torres, and Danny Walsh seemed to coordinate their efforts, taking turns to ensure that Marcus faced constant pressure throughout each workday. The trio had learned Marcus's schedule and habits, positioning themselves to maximize their impact on his daily routine. They would arrive at the coffee station whenever Marcus needed a break, making loud comments about government handouts and people who couldn't cut it in the real world. They began timing their conversations to occur when Marcus was concentrating on important tasks, discussing violent movies and news stories while standing just close enough to be distracting. Kevin Torres had become particularly creative in his sabotage efforts. As someone who had worked in logistics for several years, Kevin knew which mistakes would cause the most problems for Marcus's performance evaluations. He would intercept phone calls meant for Marcus, taking messages incorrectly or failing to pass them along entirely. When Marcus missed important communications, Kevin would express mock concern, suggesting to their supervisor that the stress of civilian work might be affecting Marcus's reliability. Danny Walsh used his family connection to his advantage, making complaints to his Aunt Janet about Marcus's intimidating presence in the workplace. Danny would describe Marcus's military bearing as threatening, suggesting that other employees felt uncomfortable around him. Since Janet valued family harmony and trusted her nephew, these complaints carried weight even though they contradicted her own positive observations of Marcus's behavior. Brad Simpson focused on psychological warfare, using his knowledge of military culture to craft insults that would hit their target most effectively. He researched news stories about veteran suicides and PTSD cases, then worked references to these tragedies into casual conversations. He would ask Marcus directly about his body count from Afghanistan, framing the questions as curiosity while making other employees uncomfortable with the implied violence. The cumulative effect of these tactics began to wear on Marcus in ways that surprised him. He had endured physical hardships, life-threatening combat situations, and extended deployments in hostile territory, but the constant psychological pressure of workplace harassment proved uniquely draining. Unlike military challenges, which had clear objectives and defined rules of engagement, this situation offered no obvious path to resolution. Marcus attempted to address the problem through proper channels, scheduling a private meeting with Janet Walsh to discuss the hostile work environment. He presented his concerns professionally, avoiding accusations while describing specific incidents that had interfered with his ability to perform his job effectively. Janet listened sympathetically and promised to investigate the situation, but her subsequent conversations with the three men yielded only denials and counter-accusations. "I talked to Brad, Kevin, and Danny about your concerns," Janet told Marcus during a follow-up meeting. "They all deny any intentional harassment. Brad says he was just making conversation about current events. Kevin insists that any communication problems were honest mistakes. Danny feels that you might be misinterpreting friendly workplace banter as something more serious." Marcus had expected this response, but hearing it confirmed his growing realization that official channels would not resolve the situation. The three men were too clever to leave clear evidence of their harassment, and their explanations were plausible enough to create reasonable doubt about their intentions. Janet was a good supervisor, but she was also managing multiple departments and dealing with her own pressures. She couldn't monitor every interaction or investigate every subtle form of workplace aggression. The situation reached a new level of seriousness when Marcus discovered that someone had been tampering with his work computer. Important files had been moved or deleted, and his email password had been changed without authorization. The company's IT department investigated and found evidence of unauthorized access from Kevin's workstation, but Kevin claimed that he had been helping Marcus with a technical problem and had forgotten to mention it. "It's probably just a misunderstanding," Janet concluded after reviewing the IT report. "Kevin has been here for years and has never had any disciplinary issues. Maybe you two should work together to improve your communication and avoid future confusion." This incident marked a turning point in Marcus's thinking about the situation. The tampering with his computer represented a clear escalation that could affect his job performance and professional reputation. If the harassment continued to intensify, it might eventually cost him his position at Davidson Manufacturing, regardless of the quality of his actual work. Marcus began documenting every incident with detailed notes, including dates, times, witnesses, and exact quotes when possible. He researched company policies on workplace harassment and reviewed his options for external complaints to government agencies. He also started varying his routines and paying closer attention to his surroundings, using skills learned in military intelligence training to gather information about his harassers' patterns and motivations. At home, the stress was beginning to affect his relationship with Sarah. She noticed that Marcus was spending more time in their garage, working on mechanical projects that allowed him to channel his frustration into physical activity. He had always been a hands-on person, but now he seemed driven to stay busy during every free moment, as if stopping to rest might allow darker thoughts to surface. "I can see that something is really bothering you," Sarah said one evening when Marcus came inside after spending 3 hours rebuilding a motorcycle engine. "This isn't like the normal stress of a new job. Something else is happening." Marcus sat down heavily at their kitchen table, his hands still stained with grease from his work. For the first time since the harassment began, he told Sarah the full story, describing the escalating pattern of abuse and his failed attempts to resolve it through proper channels. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned as Marcus detailed the psychological tactics being used against him. "This is workplace bullying," Sarah said when Marcus finished his account. "And it's affecting your health. I've seen how this kind of stress impacts people at the hospital. You can't just endure this indefinitely and hope it gets better." "What are my options?" Marcus asked. "I've tried talking to my supervisor. I've documented everything. These guys are smart enough to avoid doing anything that would get them fired immediately. They're playing a long game, trying to make my life miserable enough that I'll quit voluntarily." Sarah reached across the table and took his hands in hers. "You're not the kind of person who runs away from problems. But you're also not the kind of person who starts unnecessary fights. There has to be a way to handle this that doesn't compromise your values. I keep thinking about what would happen if I lose control, Marcus admitted. These guys don't understand what they're dealing with. They think harassment is just words and pranks. They don't realize how dangerous it could become if they push the wrong person too far. But, you're not the wrong person, Sarah said firmly. You're the right person. You have training and discipline that most people don't have. You know how to handle pressure and make good decisions under stress. That's exactly what this situation needs. Her words reminded Marcus of something his first SEAL instructor had told him during training: the most dangerous enemy is not the one who attacks with overwhelming force. It's the one who attacks your mind, trying to make you doubt your training and react emotionally instead of tactically. As December approached, Marcus knew that the situation was building toward a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. The three men had grown bolder in their harassment, apparently convinced that Marcus would continue to accept their abuse indefinitely. They had begun making physical contact, bumping into him in hallways and standing too close during conversations. Their comments had become more explicitly threatening, with references to accidents that could happen to people who didn't fit in. Marcus's military training told him that his harassers were testing boundaries, looking for signs of weakness or fear that would encourage them to escalate further. They had moved through the early stages of predatory behavior and were approaching a point where they would either abandon their campaign or commit to a more serious form of aggression. The question was no longer whether Marcus would have to respond, but how he would choose to do it. His options ranged from continued passive resistance to various forms of active confrontation. Each choice carried risks and consequences that could affect not only his own future, but also the safety of other employees and the stability of his marriage. Marcus spent long hours considering his response, drawing on years of tactical training and combat experience to develop a plan that would end the harassment while minimizing collateral damage. He knew that when the moment came, he would have only one opportunity to resolve the situation permanently. The choice he made would define not only the outcome of this conflict, but also his identity as a civilian and his ability to build a successful life beyond the military. The breaking point was approaching, and Marcus Rodriguez was ready to face it with the same courage and precision that had carried him through 8 years as a Navy SEAL. The confrontation that Marcus Rodriguez had been anticipating finally came on a cold Friday afternoon in mid-December. The day had started normally, with Marcus arriving early to complete a shipment manifest that needed to be finished before the weekend. The warehouse was quieter than usual, with several employees having left early for holiday shopping and end-of-year meetings. Marcus was alone in the logistics office, focused on his computer screen, when he heard footsteps approaching behind him. He recognized the voices of Brad Simpson, Kevin Torres, and Danny Walsh before they entered his peripheral vision. The three men had been drinking during their lunch break, and their conversation was louder and more aggressive than usual. "Look who's working late again," Brad announced, his voice carrying the false friendliness that Marcus had learned to recognize as a warning sign. The dedicated soldier boy, always trying to impress the boss. Marcus continued typing, not acknowledging the comment. He had learned that any response would be interpreted as either weakness or aggression, both of which would encourage further harassment. His strategy had been to remain professionally neutral, but the three men had apparently decided that his restraint was a sign that they could escalate their behavior without consequences. Kevin moved to stand directly behind Marcus's chair, close enough that Marcus could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You know, Marcus, some of us have been talking about your attitude around here. You act like you're better than everyone else, like your military service makes you special." "That's right," Danny added, positioning himself on Marcus's left side. "My aunt might be impressed by your hero act, but we see right through it. You're just another guy who couldn't make it in the real world and had to let the government take care of you." Marcus saved his work and slowly turned his chair to face the three men. His movement was controlled and deliberate, but all three took a half step backward, their subconscious recognition of potential danger temporarily overriding their alcohol-fueled confidence. "Is there something work-related you need to discuss?" Marcus asked, his voice calm and professional. Brad laughed harshly, apparently interpreting Marcus's measured tone as evidence of fear. "Work-related? Sure. We're concerned about workplace safety. Specifically, we're worried about having a trained killer in the office. Makes people nervous, you know?" Especially when that person has obvious mental health issues, Kevin added. Everyone can see how tense you get, how you watch everything like you're expecting an attack. That's not normal behavior for someone who's mentally stable. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down that he had experienced in combat situations. His peripheral vision expanded, his hearing became more acute, and his mind automatically began assessing threats and calculating responses. The three men had moved to surround his chair, boxing him in against his desk. Their body language had shifted from casual aggression to something more purposeful. Danny stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Maybe it's time for you to find another job, Marcus. Somewhere more suitable for someone with your condition. We wouldn't want any accidents to happen here. The threat was unmistakable, and Marcus recognized that the situation had crossed the line from harassment to intimidation with implied violence. His military training had taught him to identify the point where de-escalation was no longer possible, and these three men had just reached it. Step back, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a tone of authority that made all three men pause. Brad misinterpreted the command as a sign of weakness. Or what? You'll snap and prove that we were right about you? You'll show everyone what kind of person you really are? Marcus stood up slowly, his movement fluid and controlled. At 6 feet tall and in excellent physical condition, he was larger than any of the three men individually, but what made them step back was not his size. It was the sudden change in his presence, the transformation from mild-mannered office worker to something far more dangerous. I said step back, Marcus repeated, and this time his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had led men in life and death situations. Kevin, who had been standing behind Marcus's chair, made the critical mistake of placing his hand on Marcus's shoulder in an attempt to assert dominance. The contact was brief, lasting less than a second before Marcus's training took over. Marcus moved with the precise efficiency that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of practice. He stepped to his left, away from Danny, while simultaneously grabbing Kevin's wrist and applying a joint lock that brought the larger man to his knees in an instant. The movement was so fast and smooth that Brad and Danny barely had time to register what had happened. Do not touch me, Marcus said, his voice carrying absolute authority. He maintained the joint lock just long enough to ensure that Kevin understood the severity of his position, then released him and stepped back. Kevin scrambled to his feet, his face red with pain and embarrassment. For a moment, the three men stood frozen, their alcohol-fueled bravado evaporating as they realized they had miscalculated the nature of their target. Brad was the first to recover, his face flushing with anger and humiliation. You assaulted me, he shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at Marcus. Everyone saw it. You attacked Kevin for no reason. Marcus remained perfectly calm, his stance relaxed but ready. Kevin put his hands on me without permission after you three surrounded me and made threats. That's assault, and I defended myself using minimal force. Kevin is unharmed, and I have witnesses to everything that happened here. For the first time, the three men looked around and noticed that several other employees had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. Among them was Janet Walsh, who had arrived just in time to see Kevin's aggressive contact and Marcus's controlled response. What is going on here? Janet demanded, her voice cutting through the tension. Danny immediately began talking, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to control the narrative. Aunt Janet, Marcus just attacked Kevin. We were just talking to him about work stuff, and he went crazy and grabbed Kevin's arm. But Janet had seen enough of the incident to understand the dynamics involved. She had also noticed the strong smell of alcohol on the three men, and she was beginning to recognize patterns of behavior that she had previously dismissed as personality conflicts. Brad, Kevin, Danny, I want you to go to the conference room and wait for me, Janet said firmly. Do not discuss this incident with anyone else. I'll be there in a few minutes to get your statements. The three men hesitated, apparently expecting Janet to immediately discipline Marcus for his actions. When they realized that she was treating this as an investigation rather than an obvious case of violence, their confidence began to crumble. After they left, Janet turned to Marcus, who had returned to his normal professional demeanor as if nothing had happened. Are you all right, Marcus? I'm fine, Marcus replied. I defended myself when Kevin put his hands on me, but I used minimal force and stopped as soon as he stepped back. I'm happy to provide a full statement about what happened. Janet nodded, her expression thoughtful. I think that would be a good idea. I'm also going to need to review our security cameras and talk to the witnesses. This situation has clearly gotten out of hand. Over the next several hours, Janet conducted a thorough investigation of the incident. The security cameras confirmed Marcus's account, showing Kevin's aggressive contact and Marcus's measured response. The witnesses, including several employees who had been watching from the hallway, supported Marcus's version of events. Most importantly, the investigation revealed a pattern of harassment that Janet had previously failed to recognize. When confronted with the evidence and the testimony of multiple witnesses, the three men's story began to fall apart. Kevin admitted that they had been drinking during lunch. Danny acknowledged that they had surrounded Marcus's chair. Brad eventually confessed that they had been testing Marcus to see how he would react to pressure. The investigation also revealed that the three men had been coordinating their harassment campaign for months, sharing information and planning their actions to maximize their psychological impact on Marcus. Other employees came forward with their own observations of the harassment, describing incidents they had witnessed but hadn't reported because they didn't want to get involved in workplace politics. By the end of the day, Janet had a clear picture of what had been happening in her department. She also had a decision to make about how to respond to a situation that had escalated from workplace harassment to attempted intimidation and, finally, to physical confrontation. Marcus waited in his cubicle while Janet completed her investigation, his mind already turning to the consequences of his actions. He had successfully defended himself without causing serious harm to his attackers, but he knew that the incident would change everything about his position at Davidson Manufacturing. The question was whether the change would be for better or worse, and whether he would still have a job when Janet finished making her decisions. Monday morning arrived with an unusual quiet in the logistics department at Davidson Manufacturing. Word of Friday's confrontation had spread throughout the building over the weekend, and employees were arriving at work with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension about what would happen next. Marcus Rodriguez sat in the conference room across from Janet Walsh and Robert Davidson, the company's owner and president. The investigation had concluded over the weekend, and now it was time to discuss the results and determine the consequences for everyone involved. Marcus, Robert Davidson began, I want to thank you for your patience during this investigation. I also want to apologize for the situation you've been facing in our workplace. It's clear that we failed to address a serious problem, and that failure put you in an impossible position. Marcus nodded respectfully but said nothing. He had learned in the military that sometimes the best response was to listen carefully and speak only when directly asked for input. Janet opened a folder containing her investigation report. Based on security footage, witness statements, and employee interviews, I've concluded that you were subjected to systematic harassment for several months. The incident on Friday was the culmination of escalating behavior that created a hostile work environment. The three individuals involved have been terminated, Robert Davidson continued. Their actions violated multiple company policies, and their attempt to physically intimidate you crossed a line that cannot be tolerated. We've also reviewed our procedures for handling harassment complaints to ensure that similar situations are identified and addressed more quickly in the future. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The immediate problem had been resolved, but he was concerned about the long-term implications for his position at the company. What does this mean for my continued employment here? He asked. Robert Davidson smiled slightly. Marcus, your employment is secure. In fact, Janet and I have been discussing a promotion for you. Your handling of this difficult situation demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and professionalism we value in our supervisory staff. The promotion offer was unexpected, and Marcus needed a moment to process the information. After months of harassment and stress, the idea that his ordeal might actually lead to career advancement seemed almost too good to be true. The logistics supervisor position became available when Kevin Torres was terminated, Janet explained. You've already demonstrated that you understand the work, and your military leadership experience makes you well qualified for the additional responsibilities. The position comes with a 15% salary increase and the authority to make operational decisions for the entire department. Over the next several weeks, Marcus settled into his new role as logistics supervisor. The promotion gave him the authority he needed to implement improvements in departmental procedures and establish clear standards for professional behavior. More importantly, it sent a message to the entire company that harassment would not be tolerated and that doing the right thing would be rewarded rather than punished. The response from his co-workers was overwhelmingly positive. Many employees approached Marcus privately to express their support and to share their own observations about the harassment he had endured. Several mentioned that they had wanted to speak up but hadn't known how to address the situation effectively. "I saw what those guys were doing to you," said Maria Santos, a shipping clerk who had worked at Davidson for 10 years. "It wasn't right, but I didn't know what to say. I'm glad you stood up for yourself, and I'm glad the company backed you up." Similar conversations occurred throughout Marcus's first month as supervisor. He began to understand that his experience had been visible to more people than he had realized, and that his professional response to the harassment had earned him respect among his colleagues. The changes went beyond Marcus's individual situation. Robert Davidson implemented new training programs on workplace harassment and professional conduct. He also established an anonymous reporting system that allowed employees to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. The company's human resources department was expanded to include specialists in conflict resolution and workplace psychology. Marcus used his new position to create a more structured and professional environment in the logistics department. He implemented regular team meetings, clear communication protocols, and performance standards that applied equally to all employees. His military experience in leading diverse teams proved invaluable in managing the different personalities and work styles within the department. At home, Sarah noticed immediate improvements in Marcus's mood and energy level. The stress lines that had appeared around his eyes during the months of harassment began to fade, and he returned to the relaxed, confident person she had married. "You're sleeping through the night again," she observed one evening as they sat together on their couch. "And you're not spending every free minute in the garage anymore." Marcus nodded, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "I didn't realize how much energy I was using just to get through each day at work. Now I can focus on actually doing my job instead of just surviving it." The transformation in Marcus's professional life had broader implications for his identity as a civilian. For the first time since leaving the military, he felt that his skills and experience were being valued rather than viewed with suspicion. The leadership responsibilities of his new position allowed him to use the training and discipline that had defined his military career. 6 months after the confrontation, Marcus received a letter from Kevin Torres. The former employee had been arrested for assault in a separate incident and was facing criminal charges. His letter was an attempt to apologize for his behavior at Davidson Manufacturing and to acknowledge that Marcus's response had been appropriate and restrained. "I want you to know that I understand now what kind of person you are," Kevin wrote. "You could have seriously hurt me that day, but you didn't. You used just enough force to stop me from escalating the situation, then you stepped back and let the system work. I've had time to think about my behavior, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you." Marcus showed the letter to Sarah, who read it carefully before responding. "He's right, you know. You had every right to respond more aggressively, but you chose the path that protected everyone involved. That takes real strength and discipline." The letter confirmed something that Marcus had come to understand about his experience at Davidson Manufacturing. His military training had not made him a threat to his civilian colleagues. Instead, it had given him the tools to handle a dangerous situation with precision and restraint, protecting both himself and his attackers from more serious consequences. A year later, Marcus was promoted again, this time to operations manager for the entire facility. His success had attracted attention from other veterans in the community, and he began volunteering with organizations that helped military personnel transition to civilian careers. He shared his story as an example of how challenges could be transformed into opportunities for growth and leadership. "The most important thing I learned," Marcus told a group of recently discharged veterans during one of his speaking engagements, is that our military training doesn't make us different from civilians in a bad way. It gives us skills that civilian employers need: leadership, discipline, the ability to stay calm under pressure, and the judgment to use force appropriately when necessary. Marcus's experience at Davidson Manufacturing became a case study used by the company's human resources department to train managers on recognizing and addressing workplace harassment. His measured response to escalating aggression was cited as an example of how proper training and personal discipline could prevent workplace conflicts from becoming workplace violence. Looking back on the confrontation that had changed his life, Marcus recognized that the harassment he endured had actually served as a test of his character and values. By refusing to abandon his principles under pressure, he had not only solved his immediate problem but also established himself as a leader worthy of respect and responsibility. The three men who had tried to drive him from his job had ultimately given him the opportunity to demonstrate his worth and advance his career. Their attempt to exploit what they saw as weakness had instead revealed the strength that comes from proper training, clear thinking, and the courage to do what is right even when it is difficult. Marcus Rodriguez had successfully made the transition from Navy SEAL to civilian leader, not by abandoning his military identity but by adapting it to serve new purposes in a different environment. His story became an inspiration to other veterans and a reminder to civilian employers that military experience, properly understood and applied, represents a valuable resource rather than a potential liability.